Okay, we are live.
All right, good morning and welcome to the House Environment Committee. This morning, we are going to learn more about the Resilience Implementation Strategy. And I would just remind members that we had a change in our H319 miscellaneous A&R bill that requested that information coming in for this Resilience Implementation Strategy go from rulemaking to a report back, and it sort of triggered this interest in it. And we thought it would be really good to hear an update. Where are we with the Resilience Implementation Strategy, and what is it and where are we? So welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Great. Thanks for having us. For the record, my name is Marion Woles. I'm the Resilience and Adaptation Coordinator with the Climate Action Office.
My name is Evan Horn. I'm the Resilience Coordinator of the Climate Action Office.
So again, thanks for having us today. Excited to share with you all the work we're doing to develop the Resilience Implementation Strategy, where we are, where we're going, the relevance to the work that you all are doing. Slides along here. So the Resilience Implementation Strategy was a joint initiative announced by Governor Scott and Treasurer Pieciak early last year on January 3rd, intended to look across the work that state government does to build resilience to the impacts of climate change and look across that work to identify key themes and opportunities to develop a comprehensive strategy and then ultimately identify funding and financing sources that can implement that strategy on an ongoing basis. This Resilience Implementation Strategy was really announced after the flooding of 2023 and ahead of the flooding of 2024 to acknowledge there's a lot of work happening across state government, from the State Hazard Mitigation Plan to work to support a drought task force to grants and opportunities that come out of water quality enhancement grants that all kind of lead and help build resilience to the impacts of climate change. But needing to really look across all of that work state government does to identify where there are key priorities, acknowledging that climate change is causing severe hazards and events to become more frequent and more severe. And so we're going to have to continue to kind of look at how we build off the work of state government to support kind of climate resilience outcomes for Vermonters broadly. This Resilience Implementation Strategy will be complete on July 1st of this year. So we're a couple months away at this point, nearing the completion of this work. And will complement the development of the Climate Action Plan that the Climate Council is working on as well. Acknowledging that the Climate Action Plan looks also at mitigation opportunities and resilience as well. And the Resilience Implementation Strategy really looks at the work of state government to support climate resilience specifically. The nice partnership, I think, between the governor and the treasurer and really the work of the Climate Action Office just helps support that will yield a strategy that includes prioritized actions of how state government can build off its existing work, and then work with the Treasurer's Office to identify funding and financing opportunities to support that work on an ongoing basis. I have a slide later that speaks just to a little bit about the Treasurer's Office work in that space, but would encourage you all to chat with them about that in more detail. I will just flag, as Rep. Sheldon just shared, the nexus between the Resilience Implementation Strategy and Act 122, the Climate Superfund Act. So as you all, I think, have heard and are aware, the Climate Superfund Act that was passed last session establishes a cost recovery program. And the purpose of that program is to really hold fossil fuel extractors and crude oil refiners responsible for covered greenhouse gas emissions over a set period of time, and the damage that the emissions of those greenhouse gases causes on Vermont, and to hold those entities accountable for the share and cost associated with those emissions. Within the Climate Superfund Act, the Resilience Implementation Strategy is identified as the mechanism and really that strategy and implementation report that prioritizes climate adaptation projects and the funds that will be received through that cost recovery program. So the Resilience Implementation Strategy will really be the space where, when funds are received through the cost recovery program, projects are able to be funded, criteria established to determine how monies from that fund can be allocated. So that's the nexus there, and I think is your interest in hearing about the Resilience Implementation Strategy today.
Folks have questions along the way.
Yes, please do.
That today.
So I recognize the tie here between the Climate Superfund and the resilience activity. What is the kind of the backup plan if the lawsuits and attempts to get money from the large oil companies doesn't work and we don't get anything out of them? What's the backup plans for funding the resilience?
Great question. Well, so the Resilience Implementation Strategy, again, announced early last year, was actually an initiative announced ahead of the passage of the Climate Superfund Act. And the role of the treasurer and really the partnership between the administration and the treasurer's office was to identify what are those key priorities across state government to enhance resilience outcomes, and then look at where there are funding and financing opportunities to pair to those priority actions, absent money from a Climate Superfund Act. I think as that work and that bill was being developed, the resilience implementation strategy was already moving forward and was seen as a great place to identify those key strategies that could be funded with monies from this bill. But I think that's really the role of the treasurer, to be looking at the outcomes from the resilience implementation strategy, with the added benefit of the Climate Superfund cost recovery program, if that does move forward and we do realize funds through that, but also acknowledging that the treasurer's office is looking at other funding and financing strategies to pair with work here.
So would we expect to see some of that alternative funding mechanisms included in the report coming out in a couple of months?
Yes.
Okay, great, perfect.
Questions about that? So the resilience implementation strategy highlights 5 core components or areas of work in which recommendations and actions that fold within the strategy look across sectors and look across areas of work where climate change is really impacting Vermont, Vermonters, our natural communities, our human systems, and where we need to build resilience. So you can see the 5 with the icons on the screen here. I'll just walk through this briefly. Community-centric approach was identified as really the space where actions will be included that focus on people, our health, public health, and mental health as it relates to the impacts of climate change, our engagement with Vermonters in line with the environmental justice law, how communities plan for climate resilience and what that looks like within the work of our communities and within the state. So really that people-centric approach, and can speak a little bit more if you're interested about sort of the actions and the focus areas within that space. Oh yeah.
More would be great whenever it fits into your presentation. But
Yeah, I can speak to it now.
okay.
So I'll just kind of provide an overview. Within these 5 core components, these were sort of the 5 core areas that were called out in the initial announcement of the development of the resilience implementation strategy, acknowledging that resilience cuts across many sectors, impacts so much of the work that we do, and sort of the impacts of climate change that we feel across Vermont, that we have to sort of look broadly at resilience through these 5 core components. Within this space, and Evan, and we'll speak to this in a little bit, but we then identified more specific themes and areas of focus that were of interest to both Vermonters and then state agencies and other partners as well. And so within community-centric approach, I'll have to remember off the top of my head, we have human health and well-being, so a real focus on public health and mental health strategies and support as it relates to climate change impacts. A focus on urban community and regional planning, so really the planning supports at a local, regional, and state level that help us plan for climate resilience. Identity and empowerment, so really the engagement work that we conduct and the real need and focus to engage the most vulnerable Vermonters who are at the front lines of climate change in the development of strategies and implementation of resilience priorities. So those are 3 kind of core areas within community-centric approach where we're looking at developing and prioritizing actions and strategies within there. For the other 4, so nature-based solutions is focused obviously on the sort of nature-based solutions that help protect our communities and our environment from the impacts of climate change, but also really acknowledges that interconnected nature between our natural systems and our human systems, and the need to kind of support and ensure protections for our natural systems as well in the face of climate change impacts. Infrastructure design and reinforcement, again, fairly self-explanatory, but really looking at our built environment, our roads, bridges, critical infrastructure, utilities, water and wastewater systems, and the need to harden, repair, and maybe relocate those systems in the face of climate change impacts. Early warning systems and emergency response is focused on acknowledging that as we talk about resilience, which is really our ability to bounce back more quickly, but also be better able to quickly respond to climate hazards, acute climate hazards and threats. Early warning systems, so really our ability as humans and human communities to better be able to anticipate the impacts of climate change and respond quickly to those is an important component of what makes us more resilient. And so that core component of work is also included in the strategy. And I'll speak to it on the next slide. But because of that slightly broadened focus to incorporate not only the actions that we take to maybe reduce risk, but the actions that we're focused on to better our understanding and sort of response to climate hazards, we have a pretty broad definition of resilience for this project.
Thinking that.
Yeah,
I
it's
think
the broad
words
definition.
we use interchangeably when talking about responding to climate are
Yes,
important. And I think if you have a definition
I do. It's on the
in
next
your
slide.
work, great, okay.
Yes, yeah, sorry. Maybe I should have put it earlier, but it's on the next
That's
slide.
fine. Representative Austin.
Yeah, going back to the infrastructure
Mhm.
design, I continually am very concerned about, I think we spent $1 billion in Vermont, I don't know, over a year or a certain amount of time on responding to the destruction that climate change has brought to our state.
Mhm.
And what I'm seeing in California, Florida, some other states is insurance companies that are now pulling out, not renewing insurance. And I'm wondering if that's figured into your planning, like if, well, like our municipalities, if FEMA runs out of money, if the state doesn't have any money,
Mhm.
will municipalities, do you have a sense that municipalities will be responsible then? If a house gets flooded out, who's going to pay for either rebuilding it or relocating it
Yeah, no,
if they don't have insurance?
it's a good question. And I think, as you indicated, is a question that states across the country are grappling with. I can't speak specifically to sort of the conversations happening at a municipal level, but know and will acknowledge that as the resilience implementation strategy is really focused on how do we as state government, how does state government work, kind of support municipalities and being able to better support and provide those services and support to folks within their communities who are impacted. That question of insurance and what that looks like is factored into this. And so we'll speak to it in a moment, but part of the work to develop the resilience implementation strategy was to develop an actions inventory to look across state government to say, what's that work that's happening that has a nexus to climate resilience? And some of that information we received was Department of Finance and Management, where they're looking and really studying the impacts of climate change on insurance markets and what support they can provide to mitigate any negative impacts that might come from increasing disasters like that. I think there's a lot of conversations happening about what it might mean for, as insurance companies who are often sort of the front lines of looking at risk and saying this is no longer a risk we're willing to take on and sort of cover. What alternatives might be in place to do that? And there are certainly ideas out there. I can't speak to them in a whole lot of detail at this point, but yeah, it's a big question I think that a lot of states are dealing with. And it will certainly come up in this strategy as well.
Thank
you. Yeah.
I'd like to go back to the nature-based solutions and hear a little bit more about what those are. What does that mean in this context, Ray?
Evan, do you want to cover it?
Yeah, sure. So it's broken down into 3 categories or 3 themes. Land conservation, biodiversity is one focus. Another focus is sustainable land practices. So everything from ecological forestry to generative farming, and then a water resources and quality focus. So again, those 3 themes really capture a whole lot. But really just looking at those broadly of like, all right, where is state government? What is state government already doing for land conservation and biodiversity? Where is it supporting, technical assistance for farmers and foresters? What are we doing to, where, an opportunity might be to expand like wetland restoration. So those are kind of the 3 themes and focuses within nature-based solutions.
And so your report is going to like flesh those out more and tell us what we're doing and then where the gaps are.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we'll kind of dive into that more throughout.
Great. We didn't get to economic yet, did we?
No, we're getting there. So the last sort of core component that was called out in that initial announcement and sort of kickoff for the resilience implementation strategy is this real acknowledgement that our economic systems and the health of our environment and the impacts of climate change are so interconnected, right? We're so reliant on our natural spaces, our outdoors for economic stability in our state, but also acknowledge that a lot of our downtowns are located in flood areas. And when those get flooded, businesses are often impacted, and that has repercussions for a larger community. And so acknowledging that and really pulling out economic and environmental sustainability is a core focus area for this work as well. And that gets to, broadly economic development, what supports are available for businesses, kind of across sectors, across areas, looking not only at the kind of core climate hazard that we often feel flooding, but also drought, heavy wet snow, what that might mean for other sectors and industries and areas. And then also the planning and sort of supports that go along with that. And then the last piece you'll just see at the top here, you know, as we were kind of thinking about how to approach developing this strategy, again, acknowledging the wide definition we're having to use for this based on kind of the big focus area that was announced for this. Government systems kind of came out as another focus area for us, acknowledging that the resilience implementation strategy is really intended to look at the work state government does, the support state government provides, and the actions we already implement and how to build off and scale those better. But that the government, the way that we sort of operate, the engagement that we conduct with Vermonters is core to kind of all 5 of these components and crosses the spectrum for that work.
I have a question though about the word sustainability and whether you have a definition of that, because I've been thinking a lot about if our systems are not meeting our needs,
Yeah.
what are we sustaining? And what does that mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. We don't have an explicit definition for sustainability. But it's a big, I think a good question and a component that has come up in some conversations about this work is, you know, if we're acknowledging that climate change and the increasing severity of intense kind of acute disaster, but also the chronic events that we're experiencing, the high heat, you know, increasing heat days, invasive species migration, things like that, that is changing how our systems are able to sustain us, or sort of how we can ensure that our ability and our focus on like how we live as a state is sustainable and may need to change and adapt. I think that's where, so we don't have a specific definition for sustainability, but I think that acknowledgement that like, because the climate is changing and we're experiencing impacts from that, there may need to be changes within kind of how our systems operate.
And who's we?
So the resilience implementation strategy, great question. The Climate Action Office is leading it on behalf of the governor and the treasurer's office with close support from the treasurer's office as well. We have a steering committee made up of representatives from across state government that have a key role to play in climate action. And then the state climatologist, Dr. Leslie Dupigny-Giroux, also sits on the steering committee. So it's really a broad cross-section of state government that's focused on developing the strategy and focusing on the work. That's not to say we've had public engagement on the resilience implementation strategy already and are working through the Climate Action Office's engagement contract and partnered to do engagement with Vermonters as well. And we have a big workshop planned for Monday next week, also focused on engagement with partners across state government who really lead the actions and activities that have an nexus to climate resilience, but also external partners that engage directly with that work. So it's a broad cross-section.
Great, thanks for that. And then in your community-centric approach, are you going to be providing information or feedback on, you know, there's been a kind of conversations around what scale do we need county scale government, for example? Will that be part of your analysis at all?
Likely. I think, and we'll share it when we talk about our workshop on Monday. Our workshop on Monday is really intended to dig into some of those questions that have been raised about scale. Evan will share this in a bit. As we sort of went through and did an analysis, something we're calling the opportunity assessment, to look at the work state government does and where there might be opportunities and gaps and areas for improvement. Scale is a question we looked at, and so have highlighted areas where we've said, you know, a lot of this work is implemented at a municipal level, but there's a question for us of whether it might be more efficient or a better use of resources or support to implement it at a regional scale. So that's certainly a question we're asking, and hope we'll get some more detailed discussion about that in the coming weeks. All right, lots of great questions. Thanks all. Okay, sorry, this was not my definition slide. I forget which order my slides are in, but we'll get to the definitions in just a moment. But to outline for you all sort of the phases of work for the development of the resilience implementation strategy, I think your great questions and what was on the slide here indicate there's a sort of a broad scope of work that we're hoping to cover in this. So we broke out the timeline of the work into 3 phases, and Evan will get into it in a bit more detail. But at a high level, starting sort of early in the spring of last year, as we, you know, from January to April, we're sort of scoping out what this might look like, meeting with partners, getting our steering committee up and running. And then starting in April of last year, We worked to inventory existing activities is the kind of broad definition we use, but plans, programs, policies, funding resources, technical assistance programs, et cetera, across state government that have a nexus to climate resilience. And Evan will speak to that in more detail. We then used that inventory to identify key opportunities. So what I just spoke to in response to your question about where it might be that there be areas where we're missing something, or the scale could be different at how we implement actions that could yield more resilient outcomes. We also established a vision that is sort of guiding this work that was informed by Vermonters, both through direct public engagement that the Climate Action Office conducted, but also a real acknowledgement that resilience impacts so many different sectors, and there's so much conversation about what climate resilience means to communities. We looked across engagement efforts that other state partners and folks outside state government have conducted over the past couple of years, and sort of looked at and were able to pull out direct comments from Vermonters that related to resilience to inform the vision. This approach had a number of benefits that allowed us to be really respectful of sort of the time and the resources we were asking folks to share as they engage with us. It allows us to sort of build off of reports and engagement opportunities that maybe were led by really trusted community-based partners that have long-term established relationships in their communities, and then allowed us to really take that broad focus as we developed a vision. So phase 2, which started in the late fall of last year and is kind of working through the next month or so, is to categorize and prioritize those opportunities we identified. And again, we'll speak to that. A lot of that work we're just completing, and we'll focus on for a workshop we're holding on Monday, which is really where we'll pull stakeholders together to identify what are those specific actions to meet those opportunities we identified. So, for example, like that kind of question of scale as it relates to discussions at a particular sector, pulling stakeholders in to say, okay, as we kind of meet and look at this potential opportunity, what might those actions be? Where might there be work that can be changed or adjusted to meet that need if that's something that folks agree with? And then the last phase, which has started already, and then will continue through the completion on July 1st, is really where the Treasurer's Office comes into play in understanding the costs and then prioritizing the funding approach associated with those actions that we're identifying right now. That work, and I have a slide on it at the end. The Treasurer's Office has a kind of concurrent work group that's currently charged with looking at what are creative funding and financing strategies to fund climate resilience, to your earlier question, really identifying what's the realm of the possible. And then when we have prioritized actions, looking at how we kind of match some of those funding and financing strategies to the prioritized actions. So it's not just sort of, direct, one-to-one dollars, but maybe where they're creative insurance products or opportunities that could be paired with some of the activities that we maybe identify. Parametric insurance has come up in conversation in the past about a way that a different insurance model or product that could be utilized to support more quick liquidity, for example, for municipalities for roads after a disaster or something like that. So really looking at kind of those funding and financing models. I'm going to hit my cap at sort of my understanding of that in more detail. So I would encourage you all to chat with the Treasurer.
Just about to ask, what is a parametric insurance model?
Okay, I'm going to try. So parametric insurance is an insurance product whereby instead of most insurance models that sort of provide you a payout after you show direct damages to that asset that you have insurance on, right? A home, a road, document those damages and then receive a payout from that. A parametric insurance model essentially establishes thresholds whereby if a particular threshold is met, an agreed upon payout is provided. So for an example, parametric insurance has been used in other states to provide payouts when certain thresholds are met for flooding. So if there's a set amount of precipitation or flooding in a particular area, that preset threshold is met and a payout is provided. And what this does, it allows for a more quick allocation of funds to the holder of the insurance policy, and can also sort of be tracked to changing climate conditions. So it's a innovative model that's being tested and used in some places and has come up in discussion with some partners here. But that's, again, my level of understanding of it. So I would encourage having the Treasurer's Office in to chat about it.
Representative Austin.
Yeah, just tied with that, are you looking at permitting? I mean, in terms of being able to, I mean, a lot of times that get in the way of homeowners getting their housing rebuilt or roads rebuilt is permitting. And I know that probably would be our, our domain, but is that a concern that permitting might need to be looked at in order to facilitate, expedite the repair
process. I don't know if I would say it's a concern. I think it's certainly something we're looking at. Permitting, yes, I think can be a challenge when you're trying to quickly repair, but I think permits also exist so that we're building to a certain standard that allows us to maybe be resilient to particular climate hazards. So I think there's benefits there. I will say, as we looked across, again, state activities, we looked at sort of what are those tools available to state government to implement change, and regulatory and incentive-based programs are a lot of the work that state government does to make changes or to ensure that we're building in a way that is sustainable for our natural environment. And so that's sort of one area of focus of the inventory of work we've done and the conversations that we're having about opportunities. But I agree, I think that's comes up a lot in conversation about how do we rebuild quicker, but also rebuild in a way that's safe for us, for now and for future generations. Okay. Now we get to the definition. As I indicated, early on in this process, we acknowledged that we're taking a broad definition of climate resilience based on really those 5 buckets of work we were looking at for the resilience implementation strategy. This definition was developed after a lot of engagement with our steering committee and other partners, and is built off of and framed off of the definition of climate resilience that's used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This definition acknowledges really the interconnected systems of ecological resilience, community resilience, and economic resilience. Again, thinking about and cutting across those 5 core components that are instrumental to the resilience implementation strategy. It also, and you'll see this sort of in the first sentence there, acknowledges that the resilience is really the ability of those interconnected systems to not only reduce risk associated with climate impacted disasters and hazards, but also anticipate and withstand and then quickly recover and respond from those disasters and hazards as well. So really that full spectrum that allows us to then be thriving communities and ecosystems in the face of climate change hazards. I won't read it out for you all because you all can see it on the screen and I think have the slides, but happy to pause if you have questions.
Seeing any?
Awesome. And I'll turn it over to Evan.
Awesome. So I'm just going to dive into a little bit more about the process of the strategy. So the first step of the strategy was an inventory. Through an intake process, we conducted broad outreach to state agencies and departments, everywhere from everyone from Department of Corrections to Department of Military to ACCD to within the Agency of Natural Resources, to better understand the initiatives they manage that build climate resilience. And we asked them, what is the name and type of the initiative? What climate hazards does that program address? Which phase of resilience does it focus on? So, for example, reducing vulnerability, increasing the ability to withstand natural disasters, or does it support short-term or long-term recovery? Does it operate under any existing authority or rule? Is resilience explicitly identified as an outcome? And if and how does the initiative consider equity? What is the scale of implementation, which you asked earlier? What is it at the individual, municipal, watershed, regional, multi-state level? What decision criteria guide it? What funding sources support it? What opportunities already exist to expand? And this inventory really provided us with an overall picture of how state government is already contributing to climate resilience and help us identify those gaps, funding needs, and opportunities for better coordination and impact. And we identified 333 different state initiatives across 30 state departments, divisions, boards, and offices that live in a dynamic searchable database at the moment that we hope to make public. But that was from the intake form. We found over 30 different departments, agencies, and 333 different actions.
I have a thought on that or question. I think your numbers, which I'm just still processing.
Yeah.
Reflective of this thought a little bit. I guess I'm wondering about adding another criteria here around complexity rating or an accessibility to the average citizen rating. And I guess I would urge you in your presentations to, it's great you're organizing a lot of 333 programs or opportunities. But as you look at them, I think helping them become more available to people. And anyway, that's a consideration.
That's a great point. And I think some of what's going to come out of the opportunity assessment is like we're doing all this great work and we have all these people, all these tools available, and how do we get it out to Vermonters? And so, I think one opportunity is more technical assistance. And we might see that especially with, NRCS changing with the federal government. So, there's going to be a need for that at the state level potentially.
Yeah.
Well, and it came up recently. We were chatting with folks from the Department of Health, and they were identifying, they have related to private drinking water systems and the impact of flooding on private drinking water systems. We saw after the flooding of 2023 and 2024, the health department was able to provide free testing kits for folks who, private drinking water systems. But they acknowledge they have a lot of information on their website that talks about both what to do if your well or your private drinking system is impacted by flooding, and also steps you can take ahead of time to kind of mitigate the risk to that. But they're limited in capacity and being able to really go out to Vermonters and share that information. They said currently it's on their website and it's accessible, but they're limited in capacity to get out and use other education and communication channels to do that. So that just highlights one, I think, opportunity and space we're hoping to chat of. How can we not only help support individual programs and kind of getting that information out, but also are there bigger systematic conversations we should be having about how the Climate Action Office, for example, can support getting that information out to Vermonters about, again, what, where is their kind of home, individual household infrastructure, for example, that may be impacted by flooding, and what's the support and resources that you could utilize and have that in one place. So I think those are the questions that we're asking, and this is another example of kind of what you're speaking to a bit. Accessibility, being able to access that information and making it digestible and easily understandable for Vermonters.
Yeah, and fewer words.
And fewer words.
So that people can really get there more quickly and not have to hire a professional to help them find it.
Yeah, great point.
And I will say those numbers I shared are consistent just because we weren't able to hear back after, several pushes, reaching out to folks, but we didn't get responses. So I think that number is conservative, and there's probably more programs and more departments and offices that are doing great work.
Representative Austin.
Yeah, again, just looking at funding and capacity, that to me is like the driver of all these other things being able to occur. And again, it's a concern of mine, and it would help me calm down if you could say you have you're looking at that, or there's a plan for not only capacity, but for funding within the state. Like, I'm not looking now at the administration of the federal government to be helping us at all and just contributing to increasing, the effects of climate change. So I'm just wondering if that's at the forefront.
Yeah, 100%. That is very much the charge of the treasurer, and the Resilience Investment Working Group is coming up with, looking at what's already existing and then identifying those innovative and creative funding strategies that we can pull together. And, I don't know what that looks like yet, but, and, Marion has mentioned, but, definitely encourage you to invite them to talk more about that.
Well, and again, maybe it's not the level of reassurance you're looking for, but that is a primary outcome and component of this work, is looking at the funding question. So in answer to your question, yes, that's absolutely something we're looking at. And, to what Evan was sharing, as we were kind of conducting the state action inventory, asking folks to share information with us about the work that they lead, a lot of partners from across state government said, yeah, funding or capacity is really limiting our ability to do X, Y, and Z, or to kind of expand our, the outcome-driven focus for resilience that we're trying to provide here. So that it is a core component of the conversation and the work. We're not at the point yet where I can say, here's exactly how we're going to address that. But yeah, it's a core part of
Great,
this
thank you.
conversation. Yeah.
And so the strategy isn't just about, identifying what's already happening. It's finding those gaps and opportunities where we can really build resilience. And so as we reviewed the state inventory of initiatives, we grouped those initiatives under the components as we talked about earlier, and assess these through several lenses. Does this kind of grouping of state initiatives address all the major climate hazards? Do the actions cover all those resilience phases? Are we using a full range of tools, policies, incentives, education, conservation strategies, data-driven approaches? Are all those appropriate scales covered? Where have funding or capacity gaps already been noted from state staff? And then what Marion and I kind of did this big lift was, all right, taking this high-level approach, what additional opportunities exist for kind of collaboration or innovation across state government, and taking all this together with the steering committee and other state partners develop those opportunities, which will be discussed at the workshop next week. And so at this workshop, we have almost 100 folks coming throughout the day. And the next step is turning them into really concrete, specific actions that we can tie specific funding or rule changes or whatever to. And it's a mix of state staff and external partners that will be there that work closely with state government. And we'll try to identify those steps that we can take. How do we address challenges and leverage opportunities? What's already working? Are there existing state initiatives that could be expanded or scaled up? Are there rules that could be changed? Where do these opportunities and solutions fit in broader state efforts? Has this opportunity already been identified in other plans like the Wildlife Action Plan, the State Hazard Mitigation Plan, the Food Security Roadmap to 2035, the SCORP? There's so many other plans out there that we can really build off of and highlight and support and make sure that we're not duplicating. And so the goal of this workshop is really to move beyond assessment and start thinking about that implementation, to identify those scalable solutions, actionable next steps, and potential collaborations that will strengthen Vermont's resilience to climate change.
So I'm also wondering if there's going to be a bucket for programs that are obsolete or unnecessary.
Can you provide an example, I guess, or?
I don't have one in mind. I just think like I think that we need to incorporate that in our model of how we're using taxpayer dollars.
I guess I don't know if this answers your question entirely, but folks did share state initiatives that are, I guess, retiring or losing funding. And so we do have that in our database of actions, noting like, all right, it is going to be retired at the end of 2025, but we don't want to remove that. So that is part of, I guess, our inventory and our assessment is noting, all right, what are these programs that existed that we're kind of moving away from? Maybe it's better served under another one.
What's the universe of that? What's the number that you've identified?
Small.
Yeah, it's not a lot. We'd have to go back and look. I do think, again, the big question on everybody's mind too is the impact of federal funding on a lot of these programs. Talking with the treasurer's office, I think it's just such a big unknown right now. We're not able to kind of develop a core planning boundary around that at the moment. But I think that's factoring into this and could make that list a little bit longer. I do think it's an important question you raised though. And one of our intents of looking, as Evan indicated, we looked at kind of groupings of state actions grouped by those 5 core components I had on an earlier slide. And the intent of looking at a group of them, as opposed to looking at like every single state activity or action, was to try and see if we could pull out some core themes or questions that are coming up across that work. And not to say that, we're intending to identify efficiencies and remove particular programs, but I think there are some questions around, I bring this up quite a bit, but kind of climate modeling and the impacts, the ability of particular sectors to use kind of downscaled climate models to enhance their decision making. And there are many kind of agencies and partners that are talking about how that's relevant to their work specifically. And are there efficiencies that can be realized of having that conversation more broadly that can be a better use of taxpayer dollars of state time? Yeah.
I mean, I guess it also makes me think about prioritizing, which are the most effective. If we have to cut because we're losing federal dollars, What is it that Vermonters really need?
And that's a very important point. And I will say, in the initial kind of development and announcement of the resilience implementation strategy, prioritization of the strategies that come out of this was a key thing that the governor and the treasurer indicated was a need. And so I have it on my next step slide, maybe not on my next step slide, but after the workshop, we'll do some additional engagement both with Vermonters and with other partners who aren't able to make it to the workshop. But our steering committee is really charged with prioritizing the actions that come out of that, because we will likely have a long list of actions, but really prioritizing those needs, doing engagement around those priority efforts. And then that's where the treasurer's office comes in to then identify funding with those prioritized needs. So it won't be sort of with all of them, it will be with that prioritized set. And that's a key part of this.
We know we can't have a 100-page strategy here. We really want to make sure that we are prioritizing and being specific about what actions we want to prioritize as a state and as state government.
Great. So do you have a page limit?
Someone threw out 5. I don't know. We'll see. That feels a little
Be
unachievable.
generous and say 20.
Thank you.
Representative North?
Yeah, just following on the chair's comments,
Yeah.
that maybe an additional criteria similar to what Amy was referring to is the overlap and redundancy that likely exists
Yes.
in this myriad of different organizations,
Mhm.
many of which are not even governmental. There's nonprofit organizations that are out there doing boots on the ground work. I mean, my personal experience with trying to do exactly what we're talking about here. After I got elected in November, one of the first phone calls, and I got involved in some town planning in Ferrisburg. And one of the first things that they all got concerned about is the flooding that occurred in North Ferrisburg through Lewis Creek. And so I said, well, I'm on the environment committee, so I'd be like, that's something I can actually use my new title, representative, to go investigate. So, but it didn't take me long. Granted, I had the word representative title, after my name, so maybe that helped me along in making some phone calls. But nonetheless, I very quickly got in touch with the Department of Environmental Conservation Watershed Management Division, the Water Investment Division, the Lewis Creek Association, which is a nonprofit. And every little watershed has their own association and nonprofits. And there's a bazillion resources out there. And it didn't take me more than an hour's worth of Googling to get a hold of all these people and get phone numbers and contact them. I got a whole email chain going and forwarded that on to our town planner. So it's not like the information's not out there. It's not like there's not a bazillion resources available to do all this. So, and a lot of it probably overlapping, but they all know each other. They're all in the same business. And so it's there, it's available. It's not like it's a big cloud of mystery.
It's not a mystery, but folks don't necessarily have the ability to access it. I think that people that are working, 2 jobs, 3 jobs, it's very hard to access that, right?
Just Google it and then there it is. I'm not quite sure what you mean by so define for me what you mean by access it. You mean get money from it or get boots on the ground to show up at their house or
all the above? I think it can be challenging for some folks across the state to really know what's available. And so I think that's why we at this workshop, having those external state partners, this strategy should identify what state government can and cannot do. We recognize that there are community-based organizations, that there are NGOs, that there is, still a federal government that has programs. So what is the scope of state government here, and really, really clarifying that.
But in terms of accessing it, I don't know that people in their working their 2 jobs in their normal course of life really care, or that's not like the first thing they're worried about.
Mhm.
Where it's not until a flood event happens and they're in trouble, then, or somebody who might be forward thinking enough to recognize, man, I'm kind of building in a floodplain here. Maybe I ought to be. Then they would be activated to go look up some of this stuff, and it does just based on the one little experience I had, does seem to be pretty readily available.
Yeah, and of course, there's a lot of overlap, I think, as Evan indicated, and you indicated, with nonprofit partners and other folks on the ground, watershed groups, and then the support from state government to kind of implement that work. I will say, I think through public engagement that our Climate Action Office conducts with marginalized populations and folks, oftentimes the questions we get are, well, what programs and resources are available for me to access? And we've developed workshops and one-pagers and sheets to kind of share that with folks and bring that to conversation to really just say, here's what's currently available before we even get to the question of where would you like to see changes or where would you like to see additional improvements or where are your needs not being met.
So where does the Climate Action Office live within the
Great
hierarchy?
question. Apologies for not providing that overview. So the Climate Action Office, we sit within the Secretary's office at the Agency of Natural Resources. So we sit within the Agency of Natural Resources, but our charge is to look and help coordinate climate-led initiatives across state government. And so within the Agency of Natural Resources, or within that, we're situated there. We have other folks in our office who focus on greenhouse gas mitigation. We sit within ANR primarily due to some of the sort of legal requirements associated with ANR through the Global Warming Solutions Act and the greenhouse gas reduction requirements. But we're supported by an interagency advisory board made up of folks from across state government who have a role to play with climate action. So meet with them regularly, and they guide a lot of our work and provide a lot of feedback on our work. So apologies for not saying that earlier.
Oh, thank you.
Representative Austin.
Yeah, will there be a report? I mean, I'm assuming there'll be a report from this meeting on Monday.
It's a good question. We are, the meeting on Monday will really be the space to kind of develop those actionable steps that can be taken to kind of meet the opportunities that have been identified. I think we'll be able to post some summary of that online. Most of it will just be in the report that's available in July, kind of the finalized resilience implementation strategy. That being said, though, we are planning public engagement kind of on the actions that will come out of this process. And so suspect having some resources and material available ahead of July as we do that engagement. Yeah, and so happy to share that when we have it available.
So can we post that as that the initial report and then the one in July? Can we post that on our website?
Ken? Yeah, I mean, sure, we can.
Yeah, we're happy to come back in and chat more about it. So 2 more slides here, or just 1 more slide. Again, there's been some great questions about sort of the funding and financing opportunities, what that looks like and how that gets factored in the resilience implementation strategy. Just wanted to have a quick slide here and then encourage again you all to chat in more detail with the Treasurer's Office, who's really leading this work in partnership with us. But the Treasurer's Office is leading something called the Resilience Investment Working Group that's sort of working in parallel to the steering committee that's really guiding kind of the planning and implementation of this strategies process. The charge of that working group is to identify and advise the treasurer about potential funding and financing strategies to support the implementation of these climate resilience prioritized investments across Vermont. They're really hoping to look at and how we maximize the value of both available resources and then other additional resources. Again, if the Climate Superfund Act fund ultimately receives revenue, that would be kind of directed through the resilience implementation strategy as well. And I just share, the working group just met last week. They're looking at sort of 2 broad categories of funding and financing needs. The first being sort of post-crisis, acute event financial flexibility or liquidity to really meet those acute disaster needs. So if something happens to a community, how do we what are the available resources to quickly get kind of allow liquidity and get funds to a community or partners within the state to be able to respond quickly. But then also looking at what are those kind of proactive adaptation measures that we can utilize to kind of reduce future risk and future costs associated with events like floods, ice storms, wildfires, high winds, drought, et cetera. I think in the Climate Action Office, we talk a lot about the policies and programs that are available in the greenhouse gas mitigation space, things like weatherization or heat pumps where contractors and partners can quantify the electricity savings that are realized by taking those actions and actually use that to pay off the investment of installing a heat pump or doing a weatherization project. And that's a financial model that is usable and sort of accepted by the market. Something like that doesn't really exist for resilience. It's challenging because the savings you realize are really just are unknown. They're based on when a storm hits or a disaster happens. And so it's a little harder to kind of track and measure that. But we're sort of asking that question of, are there other models and financing opportunities that could be utilized to kind of provide better support to adaptation funding in the long run?
And are we looking at the resilience projects that we've completed for some of that informed information? I'm thinking about some of the river corridor work that I've been engaged in over time that withstood
Yeah, and there's been and studies on that from UVM about sort of the benefits to Middlebury for the, Otter Creek water wetland restoration. Yes, absolutely. And that's part of what this working group was doing in their first meeting, was doing a bit of an assessment of what do we already know, what information is out there. And they're kind of working on developing a set of recommendations to dig into further with the contractor that's supporting that work.
And I know you're not the treasurer's office.
Yeah.
We probably will try to find time to have them in, but I guess I'm also thinking about post Irene, we discovered like V-Trans wasn't really tracking by road segment how much maintenance and repairs were costing. And I don't know that that's happening now. Does either of you know that if it's happening? I mean, I think we put a lot of good money
Yeah,
after bad.
I think
That saying is.
Well, yeah, I think, obviously V-Trans would be able to speak to this better. I mean, V-Trans, I know, has a number of tools available, the Reduce Repeat Damage tool and then the Transportation Resilience Planning tool. They're both mapping tools. And I believe the Reduce, now I'm forgetting the name, but the Repeat Damage tool really tracks and indicates where are those areas of transportation infrastructure in the state that have seen repeated damages from flooding events, and where might they be able to prioritize investment for those. So I do think that's happening now.
What was the second one?
And then the Transportation Resilience Planning Tool, TRPT. Yeah, we can talk about that. Yeah, and sorry, so and Evan reminded me of another one, but the Transportation Resilience Planning Tool does a pretty in-depth analysis of flooding risk on road segments and transportation infrastructure across the state. And then also uses a grading system to prioritize what's most at risk and could be prioritized for investment. So they have a lot of guides on their website on how to use it because it's a pretty detailed analysis and mapping tool, but could be helpful to look at.
And is that for just state roads or towns too? Do you know?
Sure.
I don't know. I'd have to go and look.
And what was the third one?
Yeah. Well, so our office, it's charged with, through the Global Warming Solutions Act, is charged with developing a measuring and assessing progress tool. So a tool that sort of indicates our progress towards meeting broad climate goals and requirements. So both related to reduction of emissions, but resilience and adaptation as well. We are currently in the process of developing that tool. We're in the first phase, which is a development and assessment of metrics and indicators related to climate resilience, greenhouse gas mitigation, and identifying data sources that we have available to indicate and show those metrics in a public dashboard. So the first phase of the project is really the planning for that. The second phase, which will be kicking off later this year, is actually building out that tool and having a public-facing dashboard that will be a mix of metrics and indicators that kind of help show and track progress towards, are we building resilience in particular sectors? Are we reducing emissions? What does it mean in terms of EVs on the road and, public charging stations built? And I will say that, the question of resilience is a little more challenging. I think greenhouse gas mitigation, we have a clear metric, the reduction of, 1 million metric tons of CO2 that we're able to track. We already track through the greenhouse gas inventory. In resilience, it's a little more challenging. I think, we don't have sort of that one metric of how do you know and indicate and are able to indicate that a project had a direct benefit on resilience. What's that measurement to track it? And so looking at sort of a realm of metrics and indicators to show in a tool that can help us paint a better picture of how investments and work happening at the state and local level is leading towards more resilient outcomes. So that's another project we're leading. Happy to come chat about that another time. But that could also, and Agency of Transportation is involved in a steering committee for that work too. And I know has had a lot of conversations with our folks in our office and contractors leading that work about what data is available related to resilience of the transportation network. Yeah.
Members have further questions? Representative Austin.
I have two questions.
Yeah.
One is are you working regionally, like in New England, to look at like resources, kind of that BOCES model where, if we get flooded out or if another state gets flooded out, that you're aware of the resources and skills and knowledge that surrounds us. So
Yeah, it's a
we
good
have like some kind of cooperative.
Yeah, so Vermont as a state is a member of the U.S. Climate Alliance, which is a governor's alliance that have staff and financial support to really encourage and support regional and national learning on climate-related topics, again, both related to greenhouse gas mitigation and resilience. And so we get a lot of support and learning through that collaborative network with partners in Maine and, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New York. So a lot of learning happening in that space. And I regularly attend meetings with that group to talk about metrics for resilience and what does that look like and what other states are doing, and learning a lot from Massachusetts right now on that. So yeah, there's a lot of regional stuff.
And the other is this committee's getting used to me asking these types of questions, but what do we not know? Like, what do we not know that we don't know? Like, what questions still need to be answered in order to plan really strategically for the future, 10, 20 years ahead?
Well, so I'll there's probably a lot. We could sit here all day probably talking about it. I think to something I said earlier, a question that's coming up that we're really digging into with this strategy is climate modeling and the impacts of climate change, not only on precipitation we'll see in the state, and then that direct impact on the flooding our communities see, but also what is that going to mean for heavy wet snow and the impacts on the electricity sector. And I think there are climate models that exist at a national scale. I think when you try and really narrow in on like the impacts to a specific community or a 10 to 20 year planning horizon, it gets much more challenging. It's a big question to answer though, because to do that modeling is incredibly expensive. And so there's a real question of, is that worth our time and resources to do that, knowing that we generally understand the impacts of climate change are going to continue, and we're going to see more heavy wet snow events and more rainfall and also more longer prolonged periods of drought. So how do we sort of balance that need and that unanswered question with like the need to really take action and move this forward? So, for example, do you want to add any other things we don't know?
Representative Austin, it's a great question. I can't say we know when the next big flood is going to happen, right? Who's to say? But I will say that we do know a lot in state government, and state government is doing a lot of great work across agencies, departments. So I think we are really moving forward. Some really great work in Vermont. Is definitely a leader in many cases.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. What we have for you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. That
Thank
was
you.
really edifying, and we look forward to learning more when your work is done in July.
You to come back and share more. Thank you.
Lee, I'm interested in learning more about your work, Evan, if we get a chance to connect on that.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, members, we have Judge Zone already in the Zoom room, so I'm going to let's moving along and welcome him back to our committee and see if you could change his portrait view here on our screen. We're just transitioning, Judge, so give us 1 minute.
Of course.
And so we've asked you back. Maybe we'll just keep hearing from you throughout the session. But it turns out we have another Fish and Wildlife bill that we were interested in your perspective on, particular sections related to the courts, sections 4 and 5 in particular. But of course, if you have thoughts on other parts of the bill, we welcome those as well.
Great. Well, thank you. And thank you for allowing me to appear this morning remotely. I am Tom Zone, the Chief Superior Judge. I have taken a look at sections 4 and 5. And if we start with section 4 on page 5, on line 13, there is a reference to section 4152 as a cross-reference. That is incorrect. I don't think that's correct, because section 4152 relates to permits for scientific and educational collections. What I think the reference is intended to do is actually go to 4572, but that is my suspicion. But again, 4152 is not. It can't be correct. It doesn't work. In section 5. Section 5 addresses I'm sorry.
Well, can you speak to if the section you think it refers to, and did you have thoughts on if it does refer to either of those sections?
Well, I think it refers to section 4572, which is the subject of section 5 of H230. So I think it actually is referring to the very next topic we're going to talk about, because it would
Okay,
fit for that. What it says is that the criminal division hears all cases except, and the exception would seem to fit with 4572 because the legislature has established, by definition, specific minor violations that it does not want to be criminal, and that instead go to the Judicial Bureau. So that would seem to fit properly.
Okay, we just had Hannah Smith join us from the department. And you're just getting up to speed, but did you hear that, what
Yes.
Judge Zoney said? Yeah.
Yes, and I agree. I can go back to the drawing board, but I agree. I think it should refer to that section, which is defining minor violations. I assume this is the reference 3152.
Yeah,
Yeah,
And where are we on?
we're on
Page five.
line 12 and 13.
Thank you.
Can you explain to us how this affects your work?
Right. So the legislature has established a number of violations under section 4571 of Title 10, which is not part of this bill. The legislature identified that there is some conduct that should not have to go through the full criminal division, that it should go to the Judicial Bureau and not have the significant penalties of the $1,000 that the criminal violations would have. And the legislature specifically identified each of the categories that were not to be treated as misdemeanor crimes, but that instead were to be treated as violations and go to the Judicial Bureau. The change on page 6 of the bill, from lines 12 to the end and then on page 7, adds an additional category that the legislature says should not be treated as a crime, but that should instead be treated as a violation, civil, and go to the Judicial Bureau. The new section essentially takes the determinations that the legislature has made in sections 1.7 as policy decisions and says that, okay, we are going to essentially defer this decision to law enforcement under certain criteria. That we, the legislature, are not going to decide that these are minor violations, but we're going to allow the law enforcement officer, the warden, to decide on a case-by-case basis whether he or she believes these should be minor violations. And it sets forth criteria for that. This is something that it's a policy decision. I can't think of any other statute that allows the law enforcement officer to decide that a crime becomes a civil violation. In other words, that it's the same conduct, the same statute, but the officer has the discretion to be able to say that, well, I have decided it's not a crime and it's going to go civil. Now, there are some statutes, I would note, that could be crimes or could be civil, and the officer certainly has discretion on which way to go there. But this one it is a crime unless and until the warden decides it's not. And then when the warden decides that he or she wants to send it for a civil violation, they do that. The criteria that is set forth, I think fairly viewed, has two objective criteria. On line 15 of page 6, it says the offender has no prior history of violations. That is very clear. No room for disagreement. Line 21, it says there is no possibility of forfeiture. That would be clear because statutorily, you would know if something is subject to forfeiture. The remaining criteria are each subjective. Subject on line 16, it says the offender was cooperative and forthcoming or reported the violation. That's up to the warden. Reasonable minds may disagree about whether someone is cooperative. Line 18, subsection C, there are mitigating circumstances. That's just, again, a subjective term. What is mitigating to one may not be mitigating to another. Line 19, the totality of circumstances would lead a reasonable person to believe that the offense is minor in nature. Again, reasonable minds may disagree. Doesn't really tell us much. And on page 7, line 1, subsection F, there is no need for a criminal warrant to investigate the matter. And that also is subjective. And I note in that regard that there is a difference in law sometimes between need and want. And a law enforcement officer may say that they are seeking a search warrant. And as a judge, if they're entitled to it, I'm going to issue that. But I have to tell you that there may be times where they don't need it. They have all the evidence they've given me is very clear that they have what they need for the case, but they want it because they want to have additional information. The law says law enforcement can do that. But I point out here that I think there is, again, a subjective nature in the question of there is a need. There is no need for the warrant. And so this is a policy for the legislature to decide if it wants to defer. What's unclear on one regard and clear on another is it really the intent that the state's attorney has no discretion here, that this is solely the determination of a warden, that the warden has the ability to decide this, but the prosecutor in a criminal case would not have, or the attorney general would not have the same authority that the warden has to send it as a violation? And so that, as drafted, it does not provide the state's attorney with that authority. As far as
So we're not the Judiciary Committee, but the process now allows some flexibility through the state's attorney's office. Is that accurate?
correct, the state's attorney is in charge of prosecuting the crimes.
And they can choose. They can.
State's attorney, right now, if it's something that is currently listed under section 4572, the officer, the warden knows that if it's one of those violations, it's a minor violation and the warden issues a ticket to the Judicial Bureau. If it's anything else, the warden issues the summons, they get the complaint to court, and that's a crime, and that is prosecuted by the state's attorney or the attorney general potentially. So there is no discretion as to whether it's a misdemeanor or a misdemeanor crime or a violation, because the legislature has established what it is by statute. The state's attorney doesn't have the authority to say, well, I'm going to treat this criminal statute as a minor violation.
Yeah, and I think that the problem we're trying to solve, and correct me, Hannah Smith, if I'm wrong, is that people who are kind of, it's their first instance and they might find that they have a minor violation, but they get a criminal record through the Fish and Wildlife warden. So, and aren't even aware of it when they've resolved, they've paid their fine, they move on. They've presumably learned something, many of them, and they're not likely to repeat the offense, but they have this little criminal record issue. Is that correct?
That is one of the problems. Yes, when they are issued the criminal information, which is the ticket, there is a waiver of fine set, and often that's paid. And I think there is often confusion about the fact that they then have a criminal record, because if the resolution of that was similar to the way you would resolve a civil ticket issued by the Judicial Bureau.
Yeah, and then what's the other one that you said that was one of the problems we're trying to solve? What's the other?
Well, I think generally it's the broader issue is the policy question about whether some of these fish and wildlife violations, which have just been categorically determined by the legislature to be criminal, are really subject to the line and is the full weight of the criminal justice system. That's how the other minor violations are distinguished. And so often the question is whether those really should be. The department has gotten pushback from state's attorneys on occasion, urging wardens to use their discretion to issue civil tickets, and they don't currently have that discretion under the law. So the wardens are doing this, and they're getting conflicting pressures from the state's attorney's office. And we were attempting to resolve that in a way that would work for both the criminal division and the judicial bureau.
Judge Stoney, does that elicit a response from you?
It does. It doesn't work for the Judicial Bureau in many ways because right now, the way the process works is that under 4 VSA section 1102 subsection D, there has to be a panel that comes up with penalties. So it's called waiver penalties for each of the violations that the Judicial Bureau has jurisdiction over. For instance, again, under 4572, each of those violations has a specific waiver penalty that is identified. If this bill were to pass, essentially what the Judicial Bureau would have to do, and the panel, they would have to come up with a separate civil waiver penalty for every potential offense that the warden might decide to send. Right now, it's definable. The legislature has identified these are minor violations that are civil. The panel gets them, the panel comes up with waivers. What this bill would do is say everything is except for the big game offenses and under revocation offenses. Everything else that's a crime could be decriminalized if the warden decides to. And so in order to address that, in the chance that a warden may decide to decriminalize something and issue a violation, the panel would have to, again, come up with a waiver for every single offense that could potentially qualify.
Okay, thank you. Do you have, do you have a question,
Well,
Representative?
I think it was mostly answered. I think Colonel Stedman brought up this situation where, like, Hannah Smith talked about, where people are issued a ticket, they don't realize it's a criminal ticket, they can pay it, and then they find out later that they do have this criminal offense on their record, and that's really not the goal of the warden. And they wanted to, this was an attempt, I thought, to clarify and make the system work and not clog the judicial calendar with these offenses if people decided to go to court.
Right now, as you know, we have a backlog in the criminal division. So if the legislature were to say, we're taking a number of criminal offenses, creel limits, too many tip-ups, whatever it may be, things like that, and you wanted to decriminalize them and make them Judicial Bureau minor violations, I agree, that's going to help the backlog. That's going to take cases and get them out of the criminal docket. It's going to put them into a violation status that is the civil status. But in doing, if this is the way you're going to do it, I do think it's important to keep in mind that there's no predictability. It is entirely up to the warden. And if that's the policy the legislature wants to advance, that's fine. But this is subjective up to the warden. And so you might have a warden in one area deciding it one way and another area deciding it another. And historically, those are determinations that the legislature has made for something that is going to be treated as a minor violation.
Yeah.
In terms of one comparison is when you look at municipal bylaws and municipal ordinance violations, the legislature very clearly said that, well, the towns can say that it's going to be a crime or it's going to be a civil violation, but you have to say which one it is. Under the statute, you can't say, well, it's a crime unless we decide to change it based upon criteria. It was the legislature. This would be a different approach to addressing the discretion of law enforcement.
Yeah, and our legislative council pointed out that even on a given day, two people could have the same violation and end up in a different situation. And that's probably not something that we would want as an outcome.
It's just something we could.
Oh, go ahead, Judge.
Again, the legislature has previously taken the steps to determine that which ones are minor and which ones aren't. And that certainly is an option, and that removes the subjective nature for law enforcement. There's always going to be discretion.
Yeah. Yes.
Could we work with
Yeah, we will.
council and the wardens to find out maybe a list of some of these so we
Yep.
can? Okay.
That's how we'll go. Any further thoughts you would like to share with us?
No, that works. Thank you very much for asking for our input on this.
Yes, you're welcome. Thanks for joining us,
Thank you.
and Zoom is always a great option. So thanks for being flexible and joining us.
It's my pleasure. Have a nice day, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Okay, members, as Representative Tagliavia noted, we can work with the stakeholders to try and address this in a different manner. And that we're going to adjourn for the day. We have a joint hearing at 10:30 on the floor in the chamber. And then the floor later. Do you have a thought?
No, it's-
Okay.